Welcome to the Reinventing Transport Show, the international podcast that helps you push for better urban mobility and better cities. Today I'm talking with Stefan Bakker, who's an independent urban transport consultant from the Netherlands. We're going to be talking about electric two-wheelers because Stefan has just published a chapter about this topic. He's currently team leader of the GIZ-led Integrated Sustainable Urban Transport Systems for Smart Cities in India. That's rather a mouthful. It's an important urban transport consultancy project for the German Technical Assistance Agency. He's also working on the Green Mobility chapter of the Global Roadmap of Action for Sustainable Mobility for All, which is something you'll be hearing more about in the near future, I think. He has also had a lot of experience working in Southeast Asia and Europe with various ministries of transport and environment and for international organizations. He's also worked for a PhD recently on low carbon transport. So, Stefan Bakker, welcome to the Reinventing Transport podcast.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me. It's a big pleasure.
I just happened to come across your chapter and it struck me that it's quite timely. There's a lot of people talking about electric two-wheelers at the moment. What led you to write this chapter about electric two-wheelers?
I've been working in Asia for about 6-7 years and part of that time living there as well. And generally what struck me is that there's a lot of attention and interest in cycling, like bicycling. But on the other hand, the cities are actually, many of them are dominated by motorcycles. However, nobody is, or very few people are talking about them, both in policy circles as well as in literature and advocacy. Motorcycles are not really there in the paradigm. So I was thinking that they are very important because they are so much present. But there needs to be a better way. They need to be clean and more sustainable. I came to think that like electric two-wheelers, and there's a different range of them, are almost like a hybrid between bicycles and conventional motorcycles. So that's why I thought this is a very important topic that needs to be addressed somehow, even though I'm not an expert on that.
I was a little surprised to hear that your initial spark actually was motorcycles, because as you said, they're either neglected or in fact very often seen as a negative because of the risk to the riders and also the pollution. And yet you're looking at them as a potential thing. Are you then most focused on the most high-powered kind of electric two-wheelers, or are you also interested in the small kinds, the lower-powered kinds?
I think there's a role for a range of the different types of the electric two-wheelers. I think there can be different roles in different contexts. So let's say maybe here in the Netherlands, most of the e-bikes are those without a throttle, and they basically extend the range of a normal bicycle. So you still have to pedal, but you get an additional boost by the battery, and that will extend you. So you start from a bicycle and then you go to e-bikes or a pedelec. I think in other contexts, a electric two-wheeler could be a replacement of the electric motorcycles, the more higher powered ones. So, for example, I think that's what you've seen in China. So I think in Asian cities, there's a big potential for having electric two-wheelers substituting the electric scooters or electric motorcycles. That's what I think, yeah.
So it's a rather complicated scene, and the words kind of are all a bit confused. You've mentioned pedelec as the low-power pedal assist bicycles. Then we've got electric motorcycles, a fairly clear concept. But then we've got a bunch of things sort of in between, things with throttles, which I guess would include the e-scooters that are becoming common even in North America, where they're used as shared. In the bike share, there's the scooter share scene with various companies like Bird. How can we sort out this confusing menagerie?
I think this confusion will probably stay for a while, and that is also very interesting. I think that's what's happening in this in this space. Some people talk about micro mobility,
right?
Any vehicle under 500 kilograms. In Western Europe, I think we have lots of vehicles since a very long time below 500 kilograms. So we wouldn't call it micro mobility as such. It's just mobility, or more just efficient mobility probably. To club it as electric two-wheelers is not necessarily a problem. And for different contexts, different types of electric two-wheelers will fit that specific urban mobility space. And here in Amsterdam, we have, of course, e-bikes, the pedelecs, as I said, and then electric scooters. Also, the shared ones are slowly becoming more common as well. I think a little bit of confusion is not necessarily a problem.
Maybe a functional boundary would be something that actually you've been struggling with in the Netherlands, and Amsterdam has just recently taken a decision, I believe, which is we could have one category of all of these things that can and should be allowed in the bicycle facilities, and those things that are too fast and too powerful to be allowed in the bicycle network. What do you think? Is that a useful boundary line of small and slow electric two-wheelers and faster and more powerful electric two-wheelers?
So maybe what many people might not know is that mopeds, they're a category that maximum speed is 25 kilometers an hour.
These are gasoline-powered small bicycles.
Yeah. So, and they're still allowed on the bicycle lanes in the country.
Okay.
That's going to change next month here in Amsterdam. That's going to change finally after a long time.
Okay. People in other parts of the world may be confused because they'll think, well, that's a motorcycle. But what's the difference between a moped and a motorcycle?
A moped has a maximum speed of 25 kilometers an hour, and at the moment you don't need a helmet. They're low-powered motorcycles.
Okay.
Most people that have them, they go 35 or even higher, and they are allowed on the bicycle lanes. So you can imagine that's becoming a problem. But then the same questions might come up with electric two-wheelers. So e-bikes, they normally will go maybe 25 kilometers an hour or a little bit more, but they're generally not used that much in the core urban setting. They're not used a lot. They're mostly at the outskirts and to commute between cities or villages, where the bike lanes are very wide, and that's not necessarily a problem. So let's say the e-bikes seems to be okay, but then we have another category we call speed pedelec. It's an e-bike that has probably a maximum speed of 45 kilometers an hour, and there the question is how can we regulate those? So the compromise at the moment is that in the urban area, they have to be actually on the road, on the main road, on the main carriageway, together with the mopeds soon and cars. But outside of the urban area, they can use the bike lanes. So that's been going on for about a year. Yeah, that seems to be going fine. I didn't hear of too many accidents or issues with that, but I'm sure something will happen.
Just before we leave the Netherlands, which category of these things are increasing in numbers fastest, becoming most popular? Is it the slow pedelecs or the speed pedelecs or the other ones?
The throttle ones are slowly increasing. Same with the speed pedelecs, but the e-bikes, those that go up to 25 kilometers an hour, they are even taken most people by surprise. So the sales these days are even higher than the normal bicycles.
Let's pause there, because that seems to me to be a very significant thing. So here we have perhaps the only country in the world that really has created an environment in which people feel safe to cycle more or less anywhere. And in that context, these low-powered bicycle-style electric two-wheelers are becoming incredibly popular suddenly. That really perhaps tells us something.
Yeah, I think it does. And it's a surprise probably to many. I think 10 years ago, if you would have told somebody that students or random people would use an electric bicycle, they would have said that this is totally unthinkable. So initially, this was thought to be something very useful mostly for the elderly. But and that time it was even considered probably cheating.
I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you about that perception that it's cheating. Yes. Yeah. So go on. Cheating. Is it cheating?
That apparently has changed a lot. So now most of the sales are still with elderly people, but actually now it's pretty much across every age group, different groups are using it.
Maybe we could move. Do you want to speak about China or Vietnam next?
It's clear that China has kicked off the electric bicycle or electric two-wheeler revolution, I think you could say, because there's an interesting quote from Professor Chris Cherry, someone very famous in this space,
yes,
that the e-bike is actually the most rapid uptake of alternative fueled vehicles in the history of motorization. So that, I think, is a very interesting thing. And we have to give credit probably to China for that, because now the sales are more than 20 million annually are the sales, and the stock of electric two-wheelers is more than 200 million in China only. That is probably about 80% of the entire stock of electric two-wheelers in the world.
You had an interesting argument of why you think that came about in China. How did these things become so popular?
There's probably two reasons that came together in the 90s. So there was a regulatory decision that small two-wheelers that have pedals but also have an electric engine, electric motor, would still be classified as bicycles. And secondly, there were many cities in the late 90s and early 2000s that basically banned conventionally fueled motorcycles. So petrol-fueled motorcycles were not allowed in many cities, in the cores of those cities anymore. So people had to do something. So then people thought, those electric two-wheelers are very convenient.
I just want to make sure the listener heard that. Many people are not aware that most of the big Chinese cities have actually banned motorcycles. That's quite a striking thing. There's not too many places in the world that have done that. There's one other place I know of is Yangon in Myanmar, Burma. It's a very unusual policy, and it's had this inadvertent effect of prompting people to buy these medium-sized electric two-wheelers. So go on.
People really like two-wheelers because they're very, very flexible, very efficient. It's door-to-door mobility. So when conventionally fueled motorcycles were banned, the electric two-wheelers could take up that space.
And I guess a new reason, perhaps just in recent years, is that several of the big cities in China have started to restrict the number of new cars registered each year. So a lot of middle-class people who were thinking of buying a private vehicle now can't really get a car, and maybe they're getting these electric two-wheelers perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. And what you can see in many cities, the mode share of electric two-wheelers is quite significant already. Like even in China, which is a very big city, it's more than 15%.
Which city in China you mentioned?
In Shanghai.
Shanghai, okay, yep.
And in other more medium-sized cities, which is still, of course, more than 1 million in China, the share can easily be 20 or 30% or more for electric two-wheelers.
Just to clarify, that's the actual electric two-wheeler share, not lumped together with bicycles.
That's electric two-wheeler share. And then on top of that, there's still a bicycle share that can be anywhere between a few percent, but it can also be more than 20%.
From that data, does it look like the electric two-wheelers are replacing bicycles, or are they both present still, at least in those numbers that you've seen?
Well, this is a very interesting question, the question of substitution. And it depends, of course, where you're coming from. What is your baseline? I guess there's roughly two ways to look at it. One is to say that if the Chinese cities would not have banned motorcycles, what would have happened? I would think that people would have continued to use them.
Yes. We can look at Taiwan to see. Taiwan has enormous numbers of motorcycles, and of course, Vietnam, another neighboring country, has enormous numbers, which we'll get to next. But I guess it may not have been quite as extreme as Taiwan and Vietnam, but we probably would have seen a lot of motorcycles similar to other warm places in Asia.
Yeah, I think so. So I think that's the most reasonable way, I think, to look at which trips electric two-wheelers are replacing. But of course, there's never a way to really check that. Because now what's happening in the studies that look at substitution effects, people will ask on the street, instead of your electric two-wheeler, which mode would you have chosen for this particular trip? And then people will say it's can be walking, can be cycling, public transport, or a car or a taxi. Because these are the modes that are available right now, because a motorcycle is not available anymore. So that's not an option in the substitution question anymore.
My impression was that there are some cities that didn't ban motorcycles, but maybe I'm mistaken.
That is true, but I must admit I'm not aware of studies into the substitution effect in those cities. But it's right; not every city has banned motorcycles. That's true.
Graduate students out there who are looking for topics, there's a natural experiment there to investigate two-wheelers in China, cities that ban motorcycles and those that didn't.
Because what you see now in the substitution studies for those cities that have banned motorcycles, there is a reasonable percentage of trips that would otherwise have been taken by bicycle, also public transport, and cars or cars or taxis. And they vary from city to city. But I think the bottom line is that electric two-wheelers take significant share of all of those three modes. So from bicycles, from public transport, and from cars. So it's not that one is dominating the substitution effect.
Okay.
And that's what we can see even in Europe. We can see the same thing. So, but the key message there is that electric two-wheelers, for a very significant part, they substitute car travel. And that's the most important thing to note.
Perhaps we should briefly talk about Vietnam, and then we'll get to this question of benefits. But Vietnam is a different story again, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Probably you can say urban mobility space is basically dominated by motorcycles, even though car ownership and car use is expanding very rapidly, but it's starting from a low base. So electric two-wheelers have taken off a little bit, but they're mostly used by students. And they're of a relatively low-powered type, but they have a throttle.
Do you think they're attractive to young people because you don't need a license to use them, or perhaps because they're cheaper than a conventional motorcycle?
Both are the key reasons in my view.
There's also, of course, some worries. So, for example, some people have worried that huge numbers of motorcycles, they are maybe a gateway drug towards car ownership. I'm a little bit more optimistic. So I hear that. And yes, certainly if you sort of look at the trajectory of a certain household, they may well make that transition. But if we look at the big picture of the structure of these cities, especially the big ones, mass ownership of two-wheelers seems to not force the city to spread out in the way that mass ownership of cars does. It's possible to have a period of where almost everybody owns a motorcycle, and yet the city remains very high density, compact, and still essentially well suited to retrofitting with public transport. And so we see this in Taipei, for example. It was more or less a motorcycle city for a couple of decades. But since the middle of the 1990s, Taipei has been investing in mass transit. And so today it's an interesting hybrid. It's got plenty of cars, lots and lots of motorcycles still, but a pretty high mode share for public transport as well. And a lot of those two-wheelers are now used to feed into the public transport. But the key thing is that it remained a high-density city through that period. If the really big cities across the developing world had a period in which electric two-wheelers were a huge thing, I don't think it would necessarily send them towards high car ownership unless the authorities also invested a lot in roads and had all these car-oriented sort of planning norms. Yeah, that's just my thinking, but I'm always an optimist. Too much an optimist, perhaps.
I would like to pick up probably on one point, and I think you're making an excellent point, especially also talking about two-wheeler cities. I think that is very important, and in my view, those are quite dense. They're mixed use, and the two-wheelers provide easy access to all kinds of destinations and opportunities that people want.
Yeah, they're incredibly space efficient to park. Was one I didn't mention that, but that's one of the key factors in this story. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is something that that should be retained. So the idea of two-wheeler cities, I don't know if that is very appealing at the moment to policymakers or urban planners, but it should be in my view, because two-wheelers are very space efficient, provide high access, so they're essential actually for an efficient urban mobility system. Electric two-wheelers could maybe change in that sense, that logic going from motorcycles straight to car. And in addition, I think we have to make a distinction between ownership and use. When I was working in Vietnam, I had several colleagues say, yeah, of course, I own a car, but I go to work by motorcycle because it's much more convenient.
You had in your chapter some fairly dramatic statistics about these electric two-wheelers and their contribution. Can you reflect on that?
At some point, I was browsing through a document from the International Energy Agency, the Electric Vehicle Outlook, and one key statement in there is that in 2017, all the electric vehicles across the globe saved CO2 emissions to the amount of 29 million tons. 80% of that 29 million tons is from e-bikes in China. So e-bikes in China cover nearly all of the CO2 savings from electric vehicles across the world.
But they've received so much less attention than electric cars.
Exactly. So there are two main things that come from this this one. One is the sheer size of the fleet. So yeah, people may know that there are 200 million electric bikes, but just that they dwarf actually the number of electric cars that we have on the roads.
There was a Bloomberg article last week, I think, that said oil demand is being reduced not by electric cars, but by electric buses, especially in China. But actually, probably if they dug a little deeper, they would have found that it's the electric two-wheelers are even more significant.
Yeah, both are very important. And it was good that they highlight electric buses, but yeah, they maybe they missed the electric two-wheelers. The air quality benefits of electric bikes are very significant as well.
People have also pointed out some problems with perhaps low quality batteries of certain brands of these things, especially in China.
I think with better regulation, countries are moving to more better handling of those batteries. And slowly we're also moving to lithium-ion batteries, which have much less environmental impacts compared to lead-acid batteries, which are, as of now, most of the electric two-wheelers are lead-acid, especially in Asia.
Ah, yes. Okay. So the benefits, of course, do depend on mass uptake of these things, of electric two-wheelers. And so, you know, if I was a policymaker in Jakarta or Bangkok or Delhi, what should I be doing to promote these things and to be trying to reap the benefits from these things?
So what you can see now is that there's quite a lot of countries that actually provide subsidies to buyers of electric two-wheelers. Oh. For instance, in France, 250 euros subsidy is there.
Right.
In the Netherlands, there is no specific electric two-wheeler subsidy, but there's a general subsidy or a tax break that you can get from buying a bicycle. So if you buy a bicycle or an e-bike, doesn't matter. Okay. That's tax-free if you do it on your companies.
Presumably, this is a much more cost-effective subsidy policy than subsidies for electric four-wheeled cars.
Yes, it is, because you need only a few hundred euros to make it attractive. So definitely, that's very efficient. In Nepal, recently, also they've introduced tax breaks on the registration tax, other tax measures. So that's very significant as well. In India, there's been a policy to subsidize all kinds of electric and hybrid vehicles.
Very recent announcement, right?
Yeah, the FAME, it's called the FAME scheme, Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Electric and Hybrid Vehicles. So that scheme has been running for the past few years with let's say maybe a limited budget, but the budget is going to be increased to more than $1 billion. They target to subsidize 1 million electric two-wheelers. So that is quite significant, probably, even though, of course, it's a very big country. So these incentives, these subsidy schemes can help. And also China, in certain provinces, China is actually also subsidizing e-bikes. One thing that policymakers can consider and is being considered is to phase out conventional motorcycles. And just speaking from the Netherlands perspective, that is being done now. In the recent climate agreement that was published at the end of last year, there are two important parts that talk about this. One is that for the mopeds, the motorcycles that can go up to 25 kilometers, they should be low emission by 2025. And for the higher powered one, the motorcycles, there's the aspiration that all of them, all the new sold ones by 2030 should be zero emission.
Yes, that would be a powerful policy. You could imagine if a country like India or Indonesia, significant sized countries with huge numbers of motorcycles, if they were to adopt a timetable for the phase out of gasoline fueled motorcycles, an enormous stimulus to this electric two-wheeler industry.
Yeah, definitely. And this can be done at the country level, but otherwise it can also be on a provincial probably or even a city level.
This brings us back to the kind of electric two-wheelers that we would perhaps expect to emerge from all of this, because we know that in many of these countries, we already see mass uptake of motorcycles, small motorcycles, despite the safety worries and concerns. So there is a precedent for mass uptake of this kind of vehicle, and an electric version would not necessarily be so different. It's harder to be optimistic about mass uptake of the kind of bicycle-like, smaller electric two-wheelers that we see happening in the Netherlands, because most other places don't have what the Netherlands has created, which is a safe network for cycling on using such vehicles. I'm in Singapore, and Singapore has not really done much for bicycles in the past, but over the last perhaps 5 years, the government has started to do more for bicycles. And I noticed that the arrival of all of these electric two-wheelers is perhaps helping. I get the sense that it's helping to encourage the government to see, oh, yes, if we provide a safe network for bicycles, they'll also be used for many of these two-wheelers, and so it's worth the effort. I'm confident that electric motorcycles will probably be a big thing. I'm less confident, but just slightly hopeful that maybe even electric bicycles could also be a bigger thing than they currently are across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's encouraging what you say about Singapore, and maybe something what can be considered is construction of so-called low-speed vehicle lanes or low-speed lanes, so that there's a range of vehicles that can make use of that.
Most of the Netherlands network of safe routes for bicycles is actually not segregated bikeways, is it? It's actually quiet residential streets that are traffic calmed and have various one-way schemes so that there's very little traffic. And 30 kilometers per hour seems to be the speed. The usual regulatory thing for these two-wheelers is 25 kilometers per hour, but in practice they go a bit faster. So yeah, that kind of roughly that kind of magic number seems to be significant in this story, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And the key thing is it has to be safe to drive the vehicle that you're on. So you have to make it attractive and safe to make use of these two-wheelers. And you're absolutely right. The bicycle network in the Netherlands is partially segregated, but most of it is just residential streets where the average speed is quite low. It's either limited at 30 kilometers an hour, or it is made such that with traffic humps or relatively narrow streets that people don't go very fast. For other cities, that's probably the key thing as well. Segregated infrastructure can be considered. It might be useful in certain ways, but limiting the speed and making it safe, that's the key thing.
Yeah, and that was one of your recommendations.
Yeah, and then there's all kinds of other small planning interventions you can do. So, and these are very similar to probably the interventions that have been done in the Netherlands for cycling. So for instance, in the city of Groningen in the north of the Netherlands, basically they reorganized the cities in such a way that on a two-wheeler, effectively a bicycle, you can go anywhere in a very direct line. So the detour factor, as we call it, is very, very low on a bicycle. But on a car, you usually have to take a detour to actually get to your destination. I think it's sometimes called filtered permeability, if I'm correct. These kind of, relatively simple interventions make it more attractive to go somewhere on two wheels rather than four wheels. And I heard somebody say, like, 4 wheels is 2 wheels too many for 90% of the trips. So we need to promote mobility on two wheels. That's what I'm convinced of to make cities livable.
What would you say to people who feel that the main mass shift has to be to mass transit? Is what you're saying going to undermine that agenda, or are they complementary?
I think they're definitely complementary. Public transport is a very important part of the urban mobility ecosystem. And especially for the bigger cities, high quality mass transit is absolutely essential. That's by far the most efficient way from a space perspective to provide accessibility options to people. But at the same time, if people want to use two-wheelers, be it a bicycle, be it an electric two-wheeler, that should be facilitated as well. Because ultimately what we want is a city that is livable and that is sustainable. We want to provide a high accessibility to the population. We want to have clean air. We want to reduce CO2 emissions. We want to have less noise. We want to have more quiet cities. And we want to have space-efficient cities. So the question is, how can you achieve all those objectives? And I think clean two-wheelers are an essential part of that question.
In Singapore, the government's fairly negative attitude towards bicycles in the perhaps 1980s, 1990s, there was rhetoric that the main alternative to cars is mass transit, buses and metro, and those are the things we're going to invest in, and bicycles are just not very significant. But what happened as the metro system, the MRT, expanded was more and more people started to ride bicycles to get to the MRT because it was more convenient than the feeder buses. The government then noticed this and has started to pay attention and realized, bicycles and public transport are actually complementary.
Yes, absolutely. Here in the Netherlands, about 50% of the people that take any train arrive by bicycle. So yes, that's the bike train combination is very essential in providing high quality accessibility.
Stefan, thank you very much for your time and for your insights on this topic. We may well have raised more questions than we've answered, but I think this conversation has been wonderful in highlighting how this is a neglected issue that is very, very important. It's part of this rising discussion about micromobility. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much, Paul. I enjoyed it a lot having this dialogue with you, and I'm happy to continue our conversation.
Don't forget, you can always go to reinventingtransport.org for more information, to listen to other episodes, to find out how to subscribe, or to leave a comment, suggestion or question. Go to reinventingtransport.org. This has been the Reinventing Transport Show, and I'm Paul Barter. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.